Welcome back to another story about the river and the work that water does. Sorry, I'm holding the chart before I'm ready to do that. We've talked a lot about rivers and the work that they do on our planet, how they carve, carry, and deposit, and they shape our land. And we talked about how rivers flow from mountains, highlands, to lowlands, and those lowlands are wherever water is collected on Earth. So seas and oceans and low places and valleys. When rivers deposit their sediment, they build up the land because they're depositing. And rivers never stop doing this work. All over the planet, day and night, they never rest. They are very hard workers. They've been doing their work from the very first day water was on Earth. And now I'll show you this chart. It's just like we see here. And we can imagine that there's a river, this is land with a river running through it. And these workers, see how they're blue? They're doing the work of the water. The workers are flowing from highlands to lowlands. They're carving and carrying, and they'll deposit down where we can't see on this picture. So the river crew carries away what they've carved. They deposit this when they get to the ocean or another large body of water down at the end. We use the word erosion, to describe how rivers carve, carry, and deposit. We say that rivers erode the land, and we say the land is eroded by water. I'm sure you can imagine how big of work this is. Let me tell you about the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River carves, carries, and deposits a lot of North America. We looked at it on a picture the other day when we looked at the rivers flow from highlands to lowlands, and we saw that the Missouri, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers drain most of North America, at least the United States part of North America. Well, the Mississippi River carves, carries, and deposits 500 million tons of sediment every year. 500 million tons of sediment. Think about this, that's a year. How old do you think the Mississippi River is, or how long do you think it's been flowing? Geologists estimate that the Mississippi River has been doing this work for 150 million years. That is a long time. So 500 million tons of sediment every year for 150 million years. The Mississippi River deposits into the Gulf of Mexico, and the layers of sediment there that have been deposited from the work of the Mississippi River, those layers are at least 7 miles thick. 7 miles thick of sediment just from the Mississippi River. Now, think of all of the rivers of North America, or even all of the rivers of the whole world, and imagine how much rock is broken up and carried each and every year. It is an amazing amount of rock, and that's why we say the water shapes the land. Some of you have seen this in person with me on field trips, and some of you, maybe this is the first time you're thinking about this, but as a river goes along year after year and it cuts into the rock, the bed, remember the bed, the river lays in its bed, the bed of the river gets eroded just like the banks, and the bed of the river gets lower and lower than the land around it. And as this happens, it carves down. So remember, it flows down and out. It's carving down. It's also carving out with its banks, but it's carving down. In many of the places around the world where rivers flow, there's rain. And rain washes down the banks of the river into the river. And so some of the banks become part of the sediment too, and that's carried and deposited by the river. The bed of the river is carved by the river itself, but the banks are eroded both by the river and by the rain. The high part of the land are getting further and further apart because the banks get washed away. And a special kind of valley is formed when this happens. It's called a V-shaped valley because it's shaped like the letter V. And I know this is kind of a boring chart, but what it's showing you is the river is digging its bed, digging down here, carving. Sorry, the fan came on, I'll speak up. The river is carving down here on the bed, and the rain is helping to carve the banks, and the river's carving its banks. So this is a V-shaped valley is being carved by the river, and sometimes also by rain. Imagine that all of the land had been the same height. All of this, you can imagine this was a rectangle, and over time it eroded and eroded and eroded and made this deep, deep valley. Through time, rain washed the banks down. Some high points appeared to move further apart. The river is just flowing down at the bottom of this V-shaped valley. I have a lot of pictures of V-shaped valleys. I'm going to put them in the slideshow right now. I hope you liked looking at those pictures of V-shaped valleys. There is so much more I could tell you about the work of water in a river. I want to share one more chart with you today. Sometimes, we were talking in the V-shaped valley that sometimes rivers flow where there's also a lot of rain, and the rain helps to wash away the banks. Sometimes rivers flow in places that are very, very dry, and where very little rain falls, the river does different. It looks different. The river's still doing its work. It's still carving its bed, cutting through the land, carrying and depositing sediment. But what doesn't happen is that the river's banks don't get eroded as quickly because the rain's not helping wash away the banks. So we get what's called a canyon or a gorge. The river ends up very deep down in the land in a canyon, and on either side of the river there are very steep walls. I colored a picture of a canyon that I can share with you. Now, I'll also show you some pictures from real examples too. But this is showing you, here we have our river, and our river's flowing from these highlands out in here, and it's flowing through. But as it got to this land that you can see is very dry, there's no plants or anything up there, it got to this land that was very dry, so it eroded down. It eroded its bed, and it eroded its bed until it came down here, and it hit this low spot, and it's spreading out. You can see there's rain down here because the trees are growing down here. Anyway, because there wasn't rain to help wash away the banks, the river was able to carve straight down. You can see it has very steep, almost vertical walls. Some of you have been into a canyon before. If you were with me when we hiked Deep Creek Canyon, you'll see it's similar. There's big basalt walls to the canyon, and then we walk down the bed. So I'm going to show you some pictures of canyons. The rivers still flow through these areas, but when we look at them, we think, gosh, how could it have done all of that work? Because it doesn't seem like there's enough water. It's done it because there's been enough time. The river doesn't have to be very big. The water doesn't have to be such a large quantity. It just has to last for a very long time. So I hope that you enjoyed learning about the different work of the river and its erosion, and how we look at how rivers carve, carry, and deposit their sediment, and we call that erosion. And how places that are high in the mountains and have lots of rainfall get this beautiful V-shaped valley, and in places that are very dry but there's still flowing water, the water still flows through, but it carves down more than it carves out, and so we get deep canyons with steep-sided walls. I hope you enjoyed Erosion by Rivers. I have a lot more to share with you about erosion. Next time we'll talk about rain and waves, and then we'll even talk about ice and glaciers. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.